There was a woman in the village whom people only spoke of in hushed tones. Her name was Elira, beautiful, soft-spoken, and as mysterious as the fog that clung to the forest each dawn. Men desired her, women mistrusted her, and elders warned of her smile. For though her words were sweet as honey, they left behind the sting of ruin. Elira never raised her voice, never threatened, never struck. She didn't need to. She whispered. And those whispers twisted into minds like vines around stone. A merchant once abandoned his wife after a single evening of conversation with her. A priest lost his congregation when rumors, traced only to a breath of her suggestion, spread like wildfire. Some called her a witch, others a temptress. But those closest knew better. She didn't cast spells. She cast doubts. She didn't seduce with her body. It was her tongue, her smile, the way she could say one thing and imply another, the way she wrapped words like ribbons, then let others unwrap them into chaos. One day, a wise man arrived in the village, Cassian. He had heard of Elira's charm and the men she'd unraveled, but he wasn't interested in her beauty. He wanted to understand how words, when wielded without conscience, could do what swords could not: destroy from the inside. He didn't know it yet, but Elira was watching him too, and she had already decided that his fall would be her masterpiece. Cassian was no ordinary man. He had spent decades studying philosophy, rhetoric, and the psychology of influence. He believed in the power of truth, of clarity, and of self-mastery. When he heard of Elira, he was not drawn by lust or curiosity, but by a deeper question that had haunted him for years. Can words, when divorced from virtue, become weapons more dangerous than any blade? He arrived in the village as a traveler seeking shelter, not as a challenger. He listened more than he spoke, observed more than he judged. And it wasn't long before Elira noticed him. Unlike the others, Cassian didn't stumble over his words in her presence, didn't try to impress or please. He looked at her the way a scholar studies an ancient script, with reverence, but not blindness. Intrigued, Elira approached him by the well one morning. Her voice was silk. "You don't seem like the others." Cassian smiled gently. "I've seen the cost of pretty lies." She tilted her head. "Do you think I lie?" "I think," he said, "you understand how to say truths that wound more deeply than falsehoods." She laughed, not mockingly, but with the grace of someone who rarely meets an equal. "So, you've come to test me?" "No," Cassian replied. "I've come to understand you." For days, they walked and talked. Their conversations were laced with paradox, silence, and tension. Elira spoke of trust and betrayal, of the weakness of men and the weight of perception. She told stories, always vague, always suggestive, about how one man left his pregnant wife, how another was stripped of his title. She never admitted guilt, only described outcomes. Cassian listened. He dissected her stories the way a surgeon dissects disease. Carefully, methodically. He saw her pattern. She never gave commands, only impressions. She never shouted, only sighed. She never judged, but always hinted. Her genius was not in deception, but in the precise art of implication. She planted seeds of suspicion and let others do the watering. One evening, Cassian said, "You don't break men, Elira. You invite them to break themselves." Her smile faded, just for a second. "And what's wrong with showing someone who they really are?" "Nothing," Cassian said. "If you're a mirror. But you're a voice. And a voice carries weight." She narrowed her eyes. "You think I'm dangerous?" "I think," he said, "you are proof that not all wars are fought with swords." There was silence between them, the kind that feels like the moment before lightning strikes. Elira finally said, "Then perhaps you've come not to understand me, but to stop me." Cassian shook his head. "No, that's not my role. My role is to reveal, to show others the price of listening to what sounds wise instead of what is true." Elira's gaze turned cold. "And if they don't listen to you?" Cassian stood. "Then they will fall. And it will not be your fault. But it won't be mine either." That night, Elira sat alone by the well, staring into the water. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Doubt, and doubt, in the heart of one who had mastered manipulation, is the first fracture in a fortress built on words. Elira was not used to silence. She had grown accustomed to being the pulse of the village, not in voice, but in influence. Her whispers carried more weight than proclamations. Her presence reshaped social circles, severed loyalties, forged alliances. Even the most stoic of men found their fates altered after a single conversation with her. But now, in the days after Cassian's visit, the air had shifted. People still greeted her, but some did so with cautious eyes. Others glanced nervously, as if questioning something they could no longer name. Her influence hadn't vanished, not yet, but it had paused, hesitated. Cassian had done nothing overt. He had spoken no accusations, issued no warnings, but his presence was a mirror that reflected not her beauty, but her methods. And though she still moved with grace, her thoughts had become heavy. She paced in her home, a quiet stone cottage overlooking the woods. There were no mirrors inside. She had them all removed years ago. Elira didn't like to see herself when she wasn't performing, and now she wasn't sure who was performing anymore. The voice of doubt that Cassian had awakened was not loud. It was soft, insidious. She replayed her conversations with the men she had freed, the men who had left their wives, abandoned their duties, or turned against each other. At the time, it felt like justice. They had been dishonest, arrogant, blind. But now she asked herself, had they deserved ruin? Or had she simply preferred it? She remembered Julian, the baker's son. He had once sought her guidance, worried that his wife no longer loved him. Elira had not offered comfort. She had offered clarity in the form of a question. Do you think she stays out of love or obligation? It was just a question, but 2 weeks later, Julian had left his wife and child to find his own truth. And Elira had smiled then. She told herself she had awakened him, but now, did I unshackle him? She whispered, staring into her fireplace. Or did I simply enjoy the sound of chains breaking? Cassian's words echoed in her mind. You invite them to break themselves. A storm brewed that night. The wind howled through the cracks in her cottage walls, and for the first time, Elira felt truly alone. Not in body, but in conviction. The power of her tongue had never frightened her before. It had thrilled her. It had validated her. But now she felt its weight like a sword she could no longer lift without trembling. The next morning, she returned to the well. It had always been her sanctuary, the place where she spoke softly and others listened too loudly. Cassian was there. He did not smile when he saw her. He only nodded, respectfully. She sat beside him in silence for a time before asking, Do you think I'm evil? No, he said calmly. I think you are what happens when intelligence grows in a cage. She looked down. And you think I'm the cage now, don't you? Cassian shook his head. No, Elira, you're the key. But you've forgotten how to use it without wounding everyone around you. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, quietly, she asked, Can I change? Cassian looked at her, truly looked at her, and replied, Only if you stop seeing people as problems to solve and start seeing them as souls to understand. And for the first time, Elira didn't have an answer. Days passed. Elira did not speak, not out of pride nor shame, but awareness. The village noticed her silence, of course. People came, as they always did, the grieving widow, the jilted apprentice, the jealous wife. They expected the same sharp wisdom, the same sly unraveling of their enemies through Elira's tongue. But now, when they spoke, Elira listened, truly listened. She didn't ask leading questions. She didn't offer riddles disguised as revelations. She simply heard. It unsettled them. "What should I do?" a merchant asked, explaining how his brother had stolen from him. "I don't know," Elira said gently. "What do you want that justice to look like?" The merchant stared. "You always know." "Maybe that was the problem," she whispered. Cassian remained nearby. He never intruded, but Elira could feel his presence like a lantern in the fog, steady, observant. He didn't try to fix her. That's what confused her the most. So many men, even those she broke, wanted to fix her. They projected redemption onto her, like it was a challenge to be won. But Cassian simply let her be. And in that space, she began to see herself. One evening, she sat at the edge of the woods, watching the fireflies blink in the dusk. She remembered her childhood, how quiet she had been before she learned the world listened more to venom than to vulnerability. Her mother, before disappearing, had warned her, "A woman with a soft voice disappears. A woman with a sharp one survives." Elira had survived, but what if she had become the very voice that silenced others? She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, polished mirror. One she hadn't touched in years. Holding it up, she studied her face. Not her beauty, which had always drawn others in, but the eyes behind the mask. There were cracks, not of age, not of sadness, but truth. She saw all the words she had said to manipulate, even when she told herself it was for justice. She saw the joy she once felt when someone wept, because it meant they were finally free. But maybe they weren't free. Maybe they were just broken in a different shape. Suddenly, a voice behind her. "You've stopped hissing," Cassian said. She didn't turn. "I was never a serpent." "No," he agreed. "You were a mirror that people mistook for a snake because they didn't like what they saw." She looked at him now, tears in her eyes, but no weakness in her voice. "And what did you see?" "A woman who speaks in puzzles because she's terrified of being understood." Silence followed. Heavy, but healing. Elira lowered the mirror. "And what if I want to be understood now?" Cassian sat beside her. "Then you'll need to say what you mean, not just what wounds or awakens others." She nodded slowly. It wouldn't be easy. Words had always been her armor. and her weapon. But now she would try to use them as bridges. She would try to unlearn the art of influence and relearn the language of sincerity. The serpent wasn't dead, but it had learned to coil around truth instead of control, and Elira, for the first time, was ready to speak, not to manipulate, not to maneuver, but to connect. It was the morning of the summer solstice when Elira returned to the village well. This was the place where it had all begun, where her name first became a whisper in the mouths of mothers and a warning in the ears of men. The well had long been seen as sacred, not because of the water, but because of the stories spilled around it. Secrets dropped like coins, wishes made between clenched teeth, and Elira, with her gift or her curse, had always been near, ready to pluck truth from between the silences. Now she returned not as the oracle, but simply a woman. No veil, no charm, no audience. Still, the villagers noticed. One by one, they came, not because they needed something, but because they were curious. They hadn't seen her like this before. Unarmed, an older woman, her voice brittle as leaves, stepped forward. "I heard you don't speak like you used to." "I still speak," Elira said. "I just choose silence when silence says more." "And do you regret what you said?" Elira looked around, the well, the people, her own shadow. "No, I regret why I said it." A hush fell. It was then that a young girl approached, perhaps 10, perhaps wiser. She had bright eyes and dirt under her fingernails. "They say you could make anyone cry." Elira knelt, meeting the girl's gaze. Only if they had something inside that was already breaking. Then maybe you weren't mean, just sharp. Elira smiled. Sharpness cuts, even when it tells the truth. The girl nodded solemnly and handed her a daisy. "For when you forget, you can be soft too." The crowd slowly dispersed after that. No drama, no revelations, just a shared stillness. They saw her now, not as the all-knowing force, but as a woman standing in her own skin. And strangely, it commanded more respect than all her riddles ever had. That night, Cassian joined her at the well, where she still sat. "You didn't say much," he said. "I didn't need to," she replied. For the first time, they listened without fear. Cassian tilted his head. "Did you ever use your voice to keep them afraid?" Elira hesitated. "Yes, not always, but enough. Power's a hard thing to hold without squeezing." He sat beside her, pulling from his pocket a single folded paper. A letter. "What's that?" she asked. "A story," he replied. one I wrote before I met you, about a woman who could see through everyone but never herself. Elira unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, the words raw, unedited. She read in silence. When she reached the end, her voice caught. It wasn't just about her. It was her. The pain, the armor, the brilliance turned into blades. But most of all, the yearning beneath it all. To be understood without having to perform. I don't know how to be anything else, she whispered. Cassian took her hand. Then start by being honest. With yourself. With me. With whoever's willing to hear you, not fear you. Elira looked up at the moon, luminous and full. I think I'm ready. The serpent hadn't vanished. But for the first time, it rested its head, no longer needing to strike. The next morning, Elira stood before the mirror in her cottage. A simple rectangle of warped glass nailed to the wall, once dismissed as just a tool for her vanity. Now, it looked back with an unfamiliar clarity. For years, she had stared into it with pride, adjusting her tone, her posture, her expressions, like a musician tuning an instrument meant to pierce the hearts of others. But today, there was no audience to charm, no performance to perfect. She looked at her reflection and said nothing, and for the first time in decades, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Cassian had returned to the capital, just for a short while, he said, but his presence lingered like a warm cup left on the table. Elira found herself reaching for it in thought, not out of longing, but out of balance. He hadn't tried to fix her. He hadn't asked her to be different. He had simply seen her, even as the serpent still coiled in the corners of her being, and that changed everything. By midday, she walked the familiar path toward the hills, the place where voices once carried in the wind, the same spot where villagers had once lined up, offering coins, prayers, and secrets for her insights. But no one stood there now. Only wildflowers, blooming as if the land had taken a long, deep breath. She sat where she used to speak, on the stone ledge carved by time and ritual, and reached into her satchel. Inside was a wooden box, simple, worn. Inside it, every letter she had ever received. Letters asking for love spells, vengeance, fortune-telling, lies to be made into truths. And among them, letters from women who had once begged her to silence their husbands, to expose their rivals, to sharpen their own tongues. Elira had delivered each time, like a sculptor carving away at a block of marble, revealing not beauty, but control. She began to burn them, one by one, each letter disappeared into flame, the smoke curling like a serpent uncoiling in the air. Not out of shame, but release. This was her voice now, not the whispers that twisted hearts, but the quiet defiance of letting go. Suddenly, a child's laughter rang out. Elira turned. At the foot of the hill, a young boy chased butterflies. Behind him, a woman, his mother, stood watching with a gentle smile. She saw Elira and waved, not in fear, not in reverence, just in kindness. Elira waved back, and in that moment, she realized the curse had lifted. Not the curse the villagers once feared, but the deeper one. The belief that her worth was only as strong as her power to influence. That her voice, her mind, her presence had to be sharp to be respected. She could be whole, she could be heard without echoing fear. That night, she sat by the fire, writing. Not predictions, not enchantments, just thoughts, feelings, memories. A new voice, born not from strategy, but sincerity. The serpent still lived, curled gently in the folds of her mind. Not an enemy, but a reminder that even power can learn to rest. Seasons turned, and the village changed in ways both subtle and sudden. The whispers that once danced on the wind faded. No more curious travelers asked for potions. No more trembling wives sought hexes whispered behind silk veils. The old stone where Elira once stood to speak had moss growing over its cracks. Nature, it seemed, was reclaiming everything, including the legacy of fear. Elira herself had changed, not in the way villagers used to gossip about. No dramatic transformation, no divine punishment. Just softened. Not silent, but still. And somehow, in that stillness, she was louder than ever. The serpent that had once coiled so tightly around her spirit now rested in her like a memory, present, but no longer in control. Her voice, once honed like a blade, had become something else entirely, a thread that wove understanding rather than division. And people came to her again, not to beg, not to fear, but to talk. One day, Cassian returned, not as a messenger, not as a skeptic, but as a man who had searched the world and found fewer answers than he expected. He no longer needed Elira's words to test his doubt. He came simply to walk beside her. They sat beneath the great tree by the river, where once she cursed a man who betrayed his wife, where once she told a woman the brutal truth that shattered her marriage. But now she said nothing, and that, strangely, brought more peace than any sentence ever had. Cassian turned to her and said, "You never needed a serpent to be heard." Elira smiled. "But it taught me how the world listens. And now I listen back." She no longer kept her lantern in the window. She no longer slept with one ear open, waiting for voices to call her name in the dark. She no longer lived to be needed. She lived to be real. And in the quiet of a dusk that painted the sky in melancholic purples and soft gold, a young girl approached her. No fear, no awe, just curiosity. "Is it true you could speak and make people cry?" the girl asked, tilting her head. Elira chuckled, a sound lighter than air. "Sometimes, but I'd rather speak and make people see." The girl nodded, as if she understood something most adults never did. And just like that, Elira passed on something more powerful than any enchantment: clarity. Not as a curse, not as a weapon, but as a gift. The serpent did not die. It slept, and in its place, a woman stood, not feared, not worshipped, but known, because in the end, what truly changes the world isn't a voice that can tear through silence. It's a silence that can teach the world how to listen. In a world where words can be weapons, spells, or tools of control, Elira's story reminds us of a deeper truth. True power doesn't lie in making others tremble, but in helping them see clearly. Some use their tongues to punish. Some wield the truth to tear illusions apart. But Elira, after walking through pride, pain, and manipulation, discovered the greatest lesson of all. Listening can heal more than speaking ever could. We've all been wounded by venomous words, and many of us, knowingly or not, have wounded others with ours. But when we let go of the need to control and choose truth over tactics, we finally connect, not with someone's mask, but with their soul. Do not use your words to shatter others. Use silence to help them see themselves. And only speak when your voice carries light. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. Have you ever been hurt or awakened by someone's words? Subscribe to this channel for more thought-provoking stories that don't just entertain. They awaken. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Words can make people cry, but the right silence can save a soul. Do you agree?